Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Portsmouth Public Library's Local History Talk, the second hanging of Ruth Blay. My name is Polina Vasiliev. I'm the Special Collections Assistant here at the Portsmouth Public Library. I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Nicole Luongo-Cloutier, as she's the Reference and Special Collections Supervisor. I have a few quick notes from the library I'd like to run through before we get started here tonight. First, I'd like to read our land acknowledgement. The city of Portsmouth is on the homelands of the Abenaki people who have ongoing cultural and spiritual connections to this area. According to tribal oral tradition, Abenaki people have lived in the place now called New Hampshire for more than 12,000 years, since before tribal memory. The Abenaki are part of a larger group of indigenous people who call themselves Wabanaki, or People of the Dawn, and form one of many communities connected by a common language family. Here at the Portsmouth Public Library, we are committed to acknowledging and honoring the human history tied to this land. This program will last until, oh, pardon me, 1 second.
Okay.
8:30, and we plan to be respectful of your time. Oh, sorry, I've just lost track of my document here. If you have questions about library services or upcoming programs, feel free to ask me at the end. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to let you know about a couple of our upcoming events you might be interested in. This Sunday, October 17th, the library is hosting a genealogy workshop from 2 to 4 p.m. Michael L. Strauss from the Daughters of the American Revolution will instruct us on how to use both military and civilian records to help piece together histories of our families during this difficult period of time in the United States. And next month, we have another installment in our local history series, which will be an online presentation by lecturer and filmmaker Neil Novello on the castle stories of the Portsmouth Naval Prison. You can register online to join us at 7 p.m. on November 9th. We love hearing from you about what you'd like to see at the library. So I'll also share an online event feedback form in the chat at the end of the program. Fill it out and you'll really be helping the library figure out what programs to send you. Let me introduce our presenters for this evening's talk. So Carolyn Marvin's interest in the story of Ruth Blay began while she was working as a research librarian at the Portsmouth Athenaeum, a job from which she is semi-retired. This interest led Carolyn to pen the book Hanging of Ruth Blay, an 18th-century New Hampshire tragedy. She's also worked in both public and school libraries and has been a resident of Portsmouth since 1976. Carolyn earned a degree in American Studies from George Washington University. We also have several board members from the Friends of Ruth Blay joining us this evening. Friends of Ruth Blay, Inc. is a New Hampshire nonprofit corporation dedicated to raising awareness of and action around equity and justice issues in the Portsmouth community. Ruth Blay, the last woman executed in the state of New Hampshire, was hanged in 1768 for concealing the stillborn birth of her illegitimate child. With the History Through Art initiative, Friends of Ruth Blay supports public art installations of marginalized historic Portsmouth figures. Friends of Ruth Blay, Inc. has applied for 501c3 status and can be found at friendsofruthblay.org. We have Laura Brown and Nancy Pearson joining us this evening, and Terrence Parker might also show up here. All right. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Can I make one quick correction? It wasn't unborn, it was stillborn.
Oh, okay.
As far as I mean, the child was born. It was
yes, I think that's what's in here in the document. Either way, I'm sorry. Yes,
he claimed it was stillborn, which at that point made it questionable because she had no witness.
Oh, are we hearing some feedback?
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm gonna turn off Caroline's phone, if that's all right.
That's fine, as long as I don't disappear again like I did before.
Yeah.
But I did it. Yeah.
Okay, I think that should work right there. Okay, go. Yes, you're all set.
Okay. Thank you.
I think we'd like to hand the floor to Carolyn at this point and have her give us some background about the times in which Ruth was born, and her circumstances and background, and then the story leading up to her
Mhm.
unjust persecution and eventual hanging, if that's okay with her.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you very much. Ruth was not born to an impoverished, unknown family. She had fairly good lineage and good genealogy. She was born in 1737. She was born into a family of 7 children, 2 of whom were just previously deceased the year before. They lived in a place called Rocks Village, which is outside of Amesbury, Massachusetts, and Haverhill, sort of between Haverhill and Amesbury, their town lines at that time in provincial New Hampshire. When you're trying to research women who do not have brothers that you can follow the family name, it makes it additionally difficult because, of course, the sisters who did marry had other last names, and Ruth kind of just disappears in genealogy searches, whether I'm following her sisters to Maine or sticking with the one sister in Chester or the one sister in who stayed in Southampton. There's not much primary source material for who Ruth Blay actually was. There's very little. And I researched this for 2 years, and very little actual primary sources actually mentioned her name. Her name was mentioned in her father's will, and it was mentioned in one of the school logs where she taught as to how much she was paid. All of this is in the book. She ended up being alone with her mother and her eldest sister, presumably in Chester. And we know that that's the most likely place for her to have ended up after her mother sold the little farm in Rocks Village. And she kept that farm for 9 years, which is an amazing feat for a woman alone with 5 daughters, unmarried daughters. After the 3 had married and Ruth and she were alone and 2 had died, then she moved, as I say, presumably to the Chester area, because that's where we next find Ruth. I cannot trace her mother any further than Rocks Village, really. We do know that she was at the trial along with 2 of her sisters. Ruth became a teacher, which was one of the few things you could be and earn a reputable living in provincial New Hampshire. So she became a teacher and taught in several villages around the Chester area, in Hawk and in Sandown, and eventually in Southampton. Ruth, in the summer of 1767, became pregnant, and we don't know by whom or exactly where, but she ended up pregnant and in Southampton, where she was teaching a small group of children. New Hampshire at this time had both moving schools and Dane schools. Dane schools were exactly what they sound like. They were schools run by women for young girls to learn the rudiments of housekeeping and embroidery, etc., the finer arts, and reading presumably also. She was, well, we know Ruth was educated. We have her statement prior to execution that is very literate, but we also know that her parents were literate, and both of them signed their own wills, or rather the father signed his will. So we know that they were literate, that they came from literate families, the Chalices and the Chase, 2 of the most prominent families in the Newburyport, Haverhill area. Newburyport, Amesbury, Haverhill. Everybody moved inland when they had children and the children needed land. We also know that during that period, there was a religious upheaval and that Reverend Whitfield, who came from England in 1740, sort of stirred the embers of the revival during that period from 1740 to his death in 1770. And he was a very charismatic preacher, and he likened the problems that most of them were having, which were weather related and earthquakes and sickness, the diphtheria epidemic, which ravaged that area. And when Reverend Whitfield came, he pretty much said to people in that area that, you know, this is of your own doing, and if you repent, you will be saved, and this is to warn you, you have gone astray. And a lot of people, because they lost children, including the Blays, who lost 2 little children right prior to Ruth's birth, due to the diphtheria epidemic, and a 3rd child, after the father had died, Lydia died also of diphtheria reappearing. No masks, no shots. It makes you amazed that more weren't killed, but there were thousands killed during the diphtheria epidemic of that time. So people were ripe to hear anything that could stay the force of all these horrible tragedies, be they environmental or very personal and religious. So Ruth grew up in that atmosphere, and when she became pregnant, there was again the beginning of another revival, just a sort of very soft offshoot of the Whitfield revival, but it would emerge, as it does still every so many years, and that would make it especially hard for her to defend herself if she had been accused of having an illegitimate child who was born to her, and whether it was dead or alive, it was a real moral problem for them, that any child who died, any child was considered doubly precious because children died at such a rapid rate. So when she became pregnant, she stayed in Southampton, continued to teach some of the young girls, and eventually had the baby, which was a little girl, on her own birthday, which is tragic in itself. She had the baby on her birthday, June 10th, in 1768, and she hid the baby in a blue quilt under the floorboard of the barn. Now, the barn was also the classroom, and this is where some of the misconception has come down over the years as it's been retold. Some people have said, oh, I heard she was buried, it was buried in a classroom. Well, yeah, a barn was the classroom, so yes. And a little girl came upon the floor 3 days later when they were playing in the barn, and lifted it up and found the infant, the dead infant. And immediately she alerted the adults in the house, and then the coroner was called in, and an inquisition was formed on the body of the baby, and by an all-male group who all signed their names and declared that they felt that the baby had met its end through violence, which would mean that she committed infanticide. But it wasn't proven, and it couldn't be really proven. So she was taken in by the sheriff for a while, became very ill, possibly with childbed fever. And Dr. Bartlett, Josiah Bartlett, our own Josiah Bartlett from New Hampshire, a very famous physician during the Revolutionary period, he went over to Southampton to the sheriff's home and took care of Ruth. And when she was later carried to Portsmouth to the jail, because there was only one courthouse for New Hampshire, they had not divided into different different counties at that time, even though there was a big movement to do that. So anybody who was facing trial had to go to Portsmouth. You could send written depositions if you couldn't personally make it to Portsmouth, but she could, being from Southampton. So they brought her to Portsmouth, where she was placed in the Portsmouth jail, which was located sort of where the parking lot is, to the left of the music hall today. There's the music hall, and then to the left of it, if you're looking straight at it, there is a parking lot for the Rockingham, and that's where the jail was. And very rough-hewn jail. But we know she was shackled, and that's where she remained until her trial. And at her trial, she was found guilty of concealment of an unborn child, whether it was born, dead, or alive. So her mortal sin was not infanticide, it was concealment of a bastard child, whether it was born alive or dead. She was appointed a lawyer. We don't know exactly who it was, and I've been through all the papers at the state archives, all the legal material that is there in the archives. And we don't know exactly who he was. We don't know why he didn't bring forth some of the pleas that were being made by other women in this position. And we don't know, we only know that she was given 3 reprieves and then never received the 4th, regardless of what folkloric renditions of her story tell us. And that was another thing that was very important to me, because the folkloric representations and the fictional representations of Ruth tend to either glorify or condemn, or put her as this tragic figure in the middle. And they neglect some of the truth in order to enhance the tale. Having said that, those very versions are what have kept her story alive, at least until my book came out, because there was no book out that sought the difference between fact and fiction in her story, and sought to present only the factual parts. So she was hanged, but the night before she was hanged, she wrote a deposition that became a broadside, which is like a poster that was put in, not only printed in the papers, but put on walls around the town. And the broadside was her statement. And it was never a confession. It was not a confession. It was anything but. It was a statement of her innocence and a statement that she forgave those who she felt had testified against her. And she thanked those, such as the minister, who had helped her through this. So on the morning that she was hanged, December 30th, 1768, she went to the South Cemetery by wagon. I have found out since that outside the jail, the governor had sent a contingent of armed horseback soldiers, infantry, to make certain that she wasn't rescued or that there wouldn't be a mob outbreak, because there was a lot of sympathy for her, and to ensure she got indeed to the South Cemetery, which wasn't a cemetery at the time, was a training ground for the infantry. And there she was hanged at the exact time she was supposed to be hanged, according to the documents at the state archives. Not before, so that the Packer could get his dinner. That again is part of the folklore. And there was no last minute reprieve. All the other reprieves are very carefully preserved in the archives. No last minute reprieve can be found there. So I don't believe that ever happened either. And she was buried at the bottom of the hill, sort of where South and Sagamore meet was the high point, possibly a little closer to the south side, there are two high points when you go up there now. It's hard to know whether it was right on a corner or a little bit to the left where there's another high point directly above the oldest part of the cemetery. But there she was buried about 30 feet in from the pond. Now that land has been so disturbed over the years since it became a cemetery that it's impossible to know exactly where her body lays, but somewhere there. And I hoped that in telling the story, it would resonate not just on these, as a piece of history, revolutionary history, as a piece of local history, but also as a piece of women's history and a piece of legal history. Because although it was legal, the death penalty for that was legal and had been for some time, what you discover is that legality and the penalty was legal is not always just. So legal then and legal now does not equate to justice. And I think that's an important thing that we all need to remember. I think it's still relevant. And when I look at what's going on in Texas and even our own state, I worry more and more about women's bodies and women's selves and women's right to choose. So I'll leave it to you now, throw it back. Laura?
I actually have some questions for Carolyn. I've always been wanted to ask these questions.
Yeah.
Carolyn, can you speak to the level of shame, real or perceived, in 1767 or 1668 of a woman who is pregnant out of wedlock?
She most likely would be shunned, but there were so many that were pregnant out of wedlock, but many then went on to get married. So they were pregnant before. There are statistics proving that many, many women were pregnant before they got married. But nothing would be done to the man. If she did speak of him and mention who he was, if she carried through the pregnancy and had the child, then he would be asked to pay for the child's support, and he could be imprisoned if he didn't. But that was about it, possibly flogged. So he experienced that shame, but really it wasn't shameful. It was almost a badge of honor. I think sometimes for some men, it wasn't a big deal for men. For women, it could mean the end of their chances to get married. Even if they kept the child and raised it themselves, it especially would be difficult for someone who was a teacher, and in those days, and probably now too, was supposed to therefore be an example to them, and more so in those days, a moral example. So if you've got your minister every Sunday talking about morality and purity, etc., and the the punishment of sins, and then you have someone who actually is walking around and is a walking proof of one of those sins, yeah, they're going to be shunned. And I think although she had friends who may have stood by her, I don't know, because we don't know, aside from her two sisters and her mother, who testified for the women. It just says, she says in her final statement, two women that she was, she felt were lying, that had given false testimony. But the others, I mean, she was examined again when she was at the sheriff's house. She was examined by the sheriff's wife. She was examined by midwives. So she was subjected to quite a lot of embarrassing exams, and then to be sick on top of that. And she became very ill again in prison, very ill. And again, Dr. Bartlett is called in. So everybody kind of knew that this was a significant trial. There had been others before her, some of whom had been let off, 2 of whom had been hanged in Portsmouth. But this was right prior to the revolution. So you have to put all those facts together. You've got children dying, and you've got a revolution about to break out. You've got a governor who is there to defend the king's law, which was the law at the time. And he is a loyalist, and he has to prove his loyalty. So he's everybody's in there aren't any bad people, good people, which I think I started out with a little bit. I was just so appalled at what had happened to her that I wanted there to be a bad guy. And there really isn't. Some of them might not have been very nice, but you can't say that John Whitworth should have given her, and he was just, too weak to do the blah, blah, blah. No, he was there to uphold the British law, as was Sheriff Packer. He gets a horribly bad rap. And I've met some of his relatives, and they're very grateful that I'm not putting him down all the time, although they are looking for his grave. So that's interesting. We can't seem to find him either. And I think I was very moved by the mother, Lydia, even though we know so little about, even less than Ruth. When I started this, she was my age. And I just really identified with the mother. She had gone through the death of her 2 little babies before Ruth, and then she went to the death of Lydia, the older one. And she had to sell the farm, and her husband dies, and there isn't much money. He was a cordwainer, shoemaker. And the struggles she had to go through. And then on top of this, to have her youngest child be accused of this and be punished.
Who do you suspect was the father? What are your thoughts on who the father could have been?
I think it's quite possible he was a married man. It's even possible that she was staying with two different families in Sandown, which is what you did with moving schools. You'd go live with the family and teach the children in that area. And it could have been somebody from one of those families. Could have been an itinerant teacher where she started out, where her mother lived and her sister lived in Chester. They took in itinerant male teachers. It could have been even the reverend who preached at Hawk. And there's no way to prove any of that. We know his wife had a child a year, and he dutifully records them all in the books there, which is where I found how much Ruth was being paid. And we know that Ruth was under his tutelage and his authority while she was teaching in that area. But we can't prove anything beyond that.
Why do you believe Ruth never revealed the name of the father?
I think she loved this person. I think it was a love relationship. I think she knew it wouldn't do any good to reveal his name, and it could do a lot of harm and a lot of hurt for other people.
Okay.
And I think she chose not to.
I want to talk briefly about the law by which she was persecuted, by which she was judged. I've read it several times. It's in your book. You lay it out word for word. And it has always struck me as being a bit curious that the crime for which she was committed was concealing the birth of a child. Not, as you said earlier, not infanticide, but concealing a birth. Why was the law written the way it was?
Well, because I think men are writing it for one thing, and they don't have to face the choices and the decisions that a woman would. And women were supposed to be the moral protectors, or the protectors of the morality of society back then. They were the keepers of the morals. And I think it's written so that if she has a child a bastard child. So there you go. Already we've got one judgment. And that way, it doesn't matter whether she's, married or unmarried, young, old, by their standards. It doesn't matter if she has a bastard child, and it is not known whether it was born dead or alive, but it is so concealed. And the assumption is also made that concealment equals guilt.
Mhm.
And if you're giving birth in a barn in June, concealment might mean as simple as, I'm exhausted, I'm alone. She gave birth alone. And what am I going to do? I have to clean myself up. I have to wrap up this baby, this body, this infant, and do something. And later on, I can maybe, take it to a more proper burial place. But I think she was exhausted and probably didn't feel she had a choice.
I've had this theory since reading your book and really studying how that British law was crafted, that illegitimate children would still be welcomed in a way in that society because of high infant mortality rates and
Mhm.
because families needed every hand they could get in order to run businesses and for succession purposes. And so every life was precious, whether it was legitimate or illegitimate. And that had something to do with the way that the law was crafted, because it's always struck me as being odd.
Well, I think it's, as I said, having survived the diphtheria epidemic, people were very mindful of the need to continue to populate this area and to have children who would grow up to be responsible adults. And the statistics I read were mostly on infanticide and an illegitimacy so far as it pertained to infanticide. But the law itself, yeah, it's pretty narrow. I mean, it doesn't leave much wiggle room for anybody. It's not that it's illegitimate. It's not that, because there are other little punishments they could do for that. They could shun the woman and they could punish the man if they knew who it was. But if a child is born and you don't know and you suspect, but there's so many what if there, that of course it wasn't just to women. It wasn't at all just. And it was changed so that it wasn't a capital crime, at least. So that a woman would just sit in the square and have a rope put around her neck to symbolize the seriousness of concealing a child's birth. But it was no longer a capital crime.
So I have one last question for now from me, and that is, have you seen the section of the blue quilt that is housed at Portsmouth
Oh,
Historical
yes.
Society?
Yeah,
Okay.
I have seen it, touched it. I've photographed it. Yeah, it's at the Portsmouth Historical Society. Ruth Embry was, I never met her. She had died by the time I was doing research over there. And, but she was very interested and very keen on preserving this quilt for a reason, not because it belonged to a woman who was hanged, but because it was belonged to a woman from that period and had been given for safekeeping to the French women, and the last name being French, and that those women entrusted it to her care. And they were, I believe, Ruth's friends. And so, yeah, it's very moving for me to see it. And it's, yeah, and it's been verified to be of the time period. So by Jane Nylander. So that's as good as you can get. Jane's pretty good at verifying textiles.
So what Carol and I are talking about is a section of quilt that is Ruth's and is owned by and held by the Portsmouth Historical Society. And I don't believe it is typically out on display, although it has, I thought in the
No,
last year or two, it's been on display.
It was on display right after the book came out for a short while. They did one on quilts, and it's purported to be, I mean, there's no real, you don't have good provenance unless you have, you know, Ruth's writing my blue quilt somewhere, but it is purported to be a section of that quilt that was found. And that in turn was part of a dress that she would have had. So we can't verify that, but you look at it and you think, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah. I do not have any other questions right now for Carolyn. Should we open it up to the floor, or should we move on to some of the history of how Friends of Ruth Blay came into being and brought us to where we are now?
Sure. If anyone has any questions, you're welcome to unmute or put it in the chat, and we're happy to read them to Carolyn.
Someone has just put a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see them, Carolyn or Laura or Nancy, but Karen McNair asks, how many other women met the same fate whose stories are not remembered?
Oh, in Portsmouth, there were two women. I forgot to mention that. Thank you for the question. In 1739, two women were hanged. One was, and again, we have to look at how marginalized these women were. One was an Irish maid, and one was a widow. And even then, Irish meant Catholic. And there weren't many Catholics. There were certainly plenty of Episcopalians in Portsmouth because it was a very loyal town. But they were both accused of infanticide, and they did conceal them, but they both confessed and they both admitted to what they had done. And so their fate was also to be hanged because infanticide was a capital crime. So they were hanged for infanticide. Ruth was hanged for concealment. And there's a whole book on the numbers of women who were accused of infanticide. It's mentioned in my book. And other than that, there were three others that I know of who came near to suffering death, but who used some of the things that had been used by lawyers to successfully see them through. And one of those was that they had prepared clothing for the baby, and that could be proven. Another was that the child had in fact died, and that could be not only proven, but verified by at least one other woman. And so that had been fairly recent within the time of Ruth's life. And then there was also one in which the woman was considered mentally incompetent, and so she was not hanged. So those were successful pleas that could be made. And as Ruth says in her final statement, which is so moving and so intelligent, that she had made things in preparation for the baby's coming. And she could have proven that. But no lawyer suggested to her that she do that.
I had a question.
Yes.
Hi. You know, it says she's the last woman hanged in Portsmouth.
Yes.
So what happened with the law after this? I mean,
the law was changed about 20 years after. Fortunately, no more cases. Also, you have to understand the revolution comes along. So now we're adjusting things. We're moving into counties. That the state was divided into counties. Instead of a province, we're now a state, and we have counties where the law is meted out at the prominent city within each county. But no more women were hanged for concealment. As I say, it was changed so that if they did in fact were accused of that, they could suffer the lesser punishment of standing and being humiliated with a rope around their neck.
But were women hanged somewhere? I mean, in the state? I mean,
Not in the state. No, she
No?
was the last to be hanged.
she was the I find that amazing. I really do, you know?
Well, I think
Yeah.
I think that people found her trial, I think they learned a lot from it. I think there was a lot of sympathy for her. And I don't know how much that would have affected future trials, but I would assume it might have. That everybody now knew what they could plea and how they could plea in order to not suffer her fate.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, what do you think, Nicole?
I think we should go on to talk about your group and the project itself.
Okay, so a couple of years ago, in the before times, Nate Higgins, who is a well-known figure here in Portsmouth, he has worked at Deadwicks, he has worked at the Pickwicks franchise, well known as being Bunny Wonderland among his other characters, was volunteering for the Portsmouth 400 initiative. And again, this is the first iteration of Portsmouth 400. And he said that when he came to Portsmouth, he heard about Ruth's story and was so taken by it that it haunted him. And I don't say that lightly. And he was so moved by it, he wanted to do something to honor her story. And he brought it to the Portsmouth 400 group, of which I was a part. And we became equally inspired and decided to move toward putting a monument in one of the 5 cemeteries of the South Street Cemetery in honor of Ruth, and to create perhaps a meditation area for people who have lost children as well. And we started down the road on designing a monument. We had an entire day of programming planned. Terrence Parker, who is here on our Zoom, came in and was recruited as a designer on the project and was brought into the Portsmouth 400 fold at that point. And then the pandemic hit and everything shut down and the Portsmouth 400 planning stopped. But the little group of us who were the sort of subcommittee group of us who were so taken with Ruth's story, we never stopped. And Terrence dragged us out to the cemetery repeatedly in the winter months of the COVID shutdown, and he would find a new place in the cemetery to put a monument, and we would get turned down by the stewards of that section of the cemetery, and then we'd find a different place. And we had done a lot of work moving forward. And in fact, I can show you at this point some of the initial drawings. Let's see, this isn't going to work. Here we go. I have found some of the initial drawings that Terrence had commissioned by Carl Aschel. This was one of the original sketches for an actual monument, a physical statue. The other one we have here that I found was this one. This would have been the side view. The monument never happened. I'll let Terrence start speaking here in a minute about these 2 drawings, but the monument never happened. Terrence's landlord Terrence's shop is where the mural is. His office is on the top floor of where the mural is over on Court Street. And
Excuse me,
Terrence's
Laura.
landlord. Yes,
I
ma'am.
think we can only see your file, the small images, the thumbnails. I don't see your images opening up. I'm not sure if I'm the only one or.
I think we can just see the icons. Are
Right.
you opening
Oh, you
the-
can't actually see the picture itself. Okay.
No, are you double clicking? Or are you
Yes.
are you opening them?
Let's see if this
Are you just,
does that.
have you selected just the file manager as whatever we're viewing, or your whole screen itself on the screen share?
I've actually opened it up in a photo viewing. Oh, well, darn, that means, okay. Let me
That
see
may
if I-
not play well with Zoom. You might
Evidently isn't. Okay.
maybe, can you right click and see if there's a different option to open it with something else, open it in the web browser or something?
Let's see, open.
Nope.
Nope.
Mm.
Okay, let me see if I can't. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing so I don't bore you all with my desktop, but let me see if I don't have another programming here. Anyway, so Terrence's landlord came to him and said, I want to put some public art on the side of the building. What do we do? And Terrence said, hey, I got a great idea. And we already had the sketches done. And so Terrence, are you able to speak to how this happened so organically? And I'll tell you, we filed Friends of Ruth Blay with the state of New Hampshire in the middle of March. And by the end of July, the mural was up on the building. And so I can talk about that later, but Terrence, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I apologize. I couldn't make it back to my office. I had a project in the Adirondacks and I'm sitting in a car on the side of the road. So the lighting's really bad. Yeah, so my landlord, Todd Adelman, he's always been kind of a provocateur when it comes to public art projects. So he kind of pushed me to, figure out what we could put on the side of my office building on Court Street. And it seemed obvious that we would just adapt the Ruth Blay drawings that Carl and I had prepared for the mural. So Carl is a really good builder, but he's been doing figure classes all his life. So I had the idea of what I wanted the female figure to do, and so I hired a model to come to my office and we did the rope and everything, and Carl drew her live. So it's really Carl's sketch with me art directing the sketch that we see today. And my interest was because, I have a daughter, and women's issues are, as Carolyn probably said already, that they just haven't gone away for women. There was police brutality in London where a policeman killed a young woman, and there's, in California and even in Portsmouth. So the issues still resonate. And so that's what inspired me to do the work that I did. And from my point of view, as an artist, I really needed to have her pregnant and with a rope, because oh no, my battery's dying. So the rope to me represents the umbilical cord and her connection to her baby. So that was really important to me. And the fact that she wasn't pregnant when she was hung was less important, because the pregnancy led to the hanging, because one wouldn't happen without the other. So the pregnancy and the rope had to work together. And I really wanted her to be reaching out to the audience, because for what I learned from Carolyn's book was that she had said that there were people in the jury that bore false witness against her, but she still had compassion for those that had to do their duty and to try her, the magistrate and the judge. So I felt that she wanted to, she had the connection to, I wanted her to have a connection to the audience, so that she was really more compelling, and that she understood her circumstances, but she had to persevere, and I think she died with a lot of dignity. And I also think she was also protecting the man's family and maybe the man's children, because she had lost her own father earlier in her life. So she knew what that was like to be a woman in that era with no father. So that propelled me to try to create a really compelling image of a female in distress like we have there today. And I think Carl was able to draw that really well. So the process then became less about painting and more about just getting an image up there, because my landlord didn't want to hire a painter to do a large scale mural. And so we had to use modern technology. So the mural is actually a polyvinyl photograph, like a big decal that was kind of heat treated onto the brick or the concrete block. And that should last up to 5 years. So there's various, Laura's showing various images from different angles of the sketch. So so the hope is that there's still some monument in the future, but we felt that the women's issues and the opportunity with the landlord made us kind of work really quickly to get a mural up in the time frame that we did, because it was just at the end of January, and then it was actually executed in mid-July. And there was a lot of graphic artwork that was done by my office mate, Deb McNeely, of DBG, who did all of the graphic work in terms of the text font, and she and I worked out the size of that. And so that was a lot of extra work that isn't often known when someone puts up a mural of that size. That, you know, it has to work from a lot of angles. So I think maybe Laura ought to, if you haven't already, explained the History Through Art program, or Nancy could jump in and do that.
As I struggle with this technology, I'm going to hand that off to Nancy.
Sure. So as this nonprofit entity built its board of directors and formed and started to discuss the impact that a mural that recognized the life and the treatment of Ruth Blay, we thought, well, once that goes up, well, you know, then what? And so the idea was to create a mission for the organization that Laura mentioned earlier, that talks about marginalized people in general, and that Ruth Blay would become an umbrella organization for a much larger scope of project for other murals on other buildings around the city. And that program has many women throughout history identified for potential projects. And that project is called History Through Art. And what we're doing now is seeking partners who own buildings, who are interested in featuring some story that maybe connects or maybe doesn't connect to their neighborhood or the mission of whatever, you know, the business or the organization in that building. And we've got a couple of irons in the fire for the next project or two that we're not really going to talk about, because we don't want to steal the thunder of the organizations that will be announcing these projects. But we've identified almost, 19 or 20, well, I should say Terrence has identified almost 20 women throughout the history of Portsmouth and the Seacoast that, we can choose from. So the History Through Art is an opportunity to look at many different women of many different backgrounds from many different eras who maybe weren't treated improperly or unjustly like Ruth Blay, but maybe made a contribution in society or in the community that has since been forgotten, which is the case for many women throughout history. And so History Through Art will lift up their stories and highlight them so that, when you walk through Portsmouth and you see all the monuments of the men, well, we're going to have some murals of some women just to add to the fabric. Did I miss anything, Laura?
I would like to add that the research on the list of women was done by Laura Pope, Denise Wheeler, and and Laura Brown, and Carolyn contributed to that too. So that was a list that I kind of compiled as a secretary of the list, but it's really a list generated by others. Thanks.
Oh, thank you for that
clarification.
thank you for the clarification. I did come in at a later stage to everybody else. So thank you for correcting that.
And the PMAC had a list of wanted to add a woman composer whose name escapes me at the moment, but I think that was really exciting that they had because we didn't have a musician. We had artists and authors and suffragists and educators and politicians, but we didn't have a musician. So I wish I knew her name offhand.
I'm at a loss as far as the composer, and I'm sorry about that. I'm still trying to.
So maybe this is a good segue to talk about why we're choosing visual art and public art for this project. What do you think? Unless anybody has a question about anything that we just talked about.
I actually have a question.
Okay.
I think, Terrence, you said that the polyvinyl is good for 5 years. Do you have other plans for that space afterwards, or is it going to be restored after that time passes, if there's any sort of damage?
That's a great question. So my landlord was interested in the temporary aspect of the mural because it's not painted and semi-permanent. So that was actually a benefit to my landlord. So I think the hope of the group is that, in 5 years' time that we can do a grave marker for Ruth Blay. And at the end of that, maybe we put up another woman in the same space. So then we take that down and there's another woman in the same space. So I think as an artist, what I like is to cull through history, whether it's history that I research or history that somebody like Carolyn has researched, and come up with my own interpretation of the story to come at it from another angle. So it's less literal and more kind of interpretive and maybe provocative if that's the right thing to do with the different stories. So our hope is that different artists will do different women, and then we'll have different perspectives on that. So we tell a more complete story of that person's life. But it's really based in historians digging through to find the facts of that person, because the art, in terms of my own process, should be pretty correct in detail, but but it should be an interpretive and metaphoric thing, and not so literally historic.
I wanted to say something, if I could, about the marker at the cemetery. This was something that I wanted to work on 10 years ago when I wrote the book. And I've talked to friends of Ruth Blay about it too, because Mark Cancelata, who has a website on Ruth Blay, or excuse me, not a website, a Facebook page on Ruth Blay. And I had thought of the having a bench years ago, and I had mentioned it to the 400th committee that that's what I wanted to do and still want to do. I want something simple where people can sit down and think about whatever they want to think, but that at least they will have in their mind what the bench is for, what it evokes. And so I'm continuing to work along with Mark on that, and hopefully also with the friends, if they're willing to. That was something I really wanted to follow through on, and would appreciate that support.
Yeah, I'm sure that'll happen when everything, when the momentum, keeps going, and then we can develop some funds, that there'll be something there. So we're hoping that the mural will stimulate that activity to create the grave marker.
Yeah, I hope you'll keep me involved.
We absolutely will.
Yeah.
Mhm. You own this story. You own the stewardship of Ruth's story here in Portsmouth and in New Hampshire.
Well, I don't think anybody owns the story. I think it's a story that should belong to everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interest.
So
But
what's
I did own the idea of putting a bench at that cemetery, and that's what I would like to follow through
Yeah.
on.
What's
I'm-
fun
I'm
for
s-
me being in the, because my office is right there, that I can see how many people come and visit and read the text that's on the side of the building. So it gets a lot of eyes, whether it's a passerby or in a car or on a bike or walkers. But there are people that they stop and spend a lot of time, reading the text and looking at the mural. So I think it's successful for that reason. And I think there's some groups that came by. Mary Jo Brown came by with an art group that we talked to, and that was really fun. So there's a young group of women that were interested in the history and how it came to be. And so there's others. I think people migrate over from the African burying ground and experience the Ruth Blay mural. So it's well positioned right there. So I think
It
that's
is.
kind of a positive thing.
Yeah, it is. I was thinking this was, I think, named the second Ruth Blay, the second hanging, or second hanging of Ruth Blay. And I know that's the double entendre and the,
Yeah.
hanging the
So-
mural. But I was also thinking it could have easily been named the rebirth of Ruth Blay, because it has, I think, generated a new interest in her story.
Yeah, no,
Coming of Ruth Blay, if you will.
yeah. So in a kind of tangential sidebar thing, there was a holiday, Labor Day holiday. My brothers and I were getting together in the Catskill Mountains, and one of my brother's wives brought up a stack of newspapers, and they suddenly said, "Oh, there's the story of the." It was from Providence. They drove up to New York from Providence, and the Providence Journal had covered verbatim the Portsmouth Herald story. They just repeated everything, so it played out in Providence. I don't know where else it played out, but it did. The whole story was repeated in the Providence Journal in the New England section on one Sunday or Friday. I forget what day it was, but so that's a little more airplay.
Yep.
I'm sorry. I'm trying desperately to do a PowerPoint so I can. Were you able to see one of the pictures? I think you did, because I think I saw Paulina put her thumb up. So
Yes,
all
we
right.
did. We saw 2 pictures so far. Maybe we could go back. There is one question in the chat from Karen. Where did the late for dinner story come from? And maybe Carolyn could explain what that story is and give us her insights.
Yeah, in the early 1800s, 1825, I think it was, Albert Leighton, who was a Portsmouth poet, had heard of the Ruth Blay story, and he decided to write the Ballad of Ruth Blay.
Oh.
And the Ballad of Ruth Blay, it mentions it's rather dramatized. It talks about her being dressed in silk and going, up to the cemetery, and that the Sheriff Packer did not want his dinner to be late, so he hanged her early. But none of the archival documents agree with this. Everything is written, the time is written down in each archival reprieve, and it's always the same time, and it's the time she was hanged. So that's where that came from.
There was also a question. Again, Karen, thank you for your questions. How can we help get a monument at South Cemetery?
Well, I'm wondering if I don't really want a monument. I just want a simple bench. And I really kind of feel the simplicity is important. Ruth Blay did not I just feel it's what Ruth Blay would want. She was not, from her declaration and confession, she was not out there to promote herself or in any way call additional attention to herself. I think she just wanted to express her feelings both about her pregnancy, about the birth, the sadness of it, her own grief, and her forgiveness for those who had contributed to it, to her fate. And I think we should keep it in line with that. So a simple granite bench, perhaps with a saying on it, and the dates of her life. And I would like to start a GoFundMe page, and certainly start it with my own honorarium here. Thank you very much, but I will donate that to that. And Mark and I will work on getting that up and going. So look for it. It'll be coming. I've never done that before, but it seems like a good time to do it.
And we will support it in any way we can, with publicity and fundraising efforts to make that happen.
It can be done. It's not going to be that expensive. I've looked into some of the possibilities, and yes, it's going to cost, but not excessively.
Excellent. Nicole, did you have?
I don't see any other questions in the chat, but if anyone has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
So in the background, I have been trying to pull up pictures and create a PowerPoint on the fly. I know Terrence talked briefly about the actual mural, but at the risk of sounding a bit crass, it's a lot like contact paper that has been printed in high resolution. And the image of Ruth was actually done in 4 sections, starting with her feet. I'll see if I can't, well, I'll see if this will work. This will give you some idea of, can you see that?
Yes.
This picture here? Okay. So you can see this picture here. This is the second section up. And the gentlemen have centered it with the registration marks, and they have pulled it down forward and are pulling the back off so that they may start from the bottom and smooth it up the side of the building. And once they get done with that, they then take brayers and roll it. And the brayer has a handle, a place on top that holds a heat gun. So they're heating the fabric, the material, at the same time that they're rolling it, and it sticks to the building. And then, Terrence, they sealed it afterwards, correct? Like the day afterwards or the week afterwards?
No, the day after they had heat sealed it, they sealed the edges with some similar kind of glue, so you can see that there's a little like 1/2 inch, just so there's no wind or rain that gets between the polyvinyl and the concrete block. So it just seals the edges. So it's very obscure, but you can see that there is a dark little glue that goes around just on the edge.
Okay. And you did mention that whenever it is that the mural of Ruth has met its natural end, that we will replace it with a different woman, correct?
Yeah, that's the hope, and I think my landlord Todd Adelman would be game for that too, because he was the patron of this, so he footed the whole bill for the expense of the mural. So hopefully he's still game for that down the road.
And while we can't really say much about the next installation, we perhaps can say that it will be located in the very same neighborhood as Ruth's, and we're kind of hoping that Court Street becomes sort of a corridor of history through art women. We have also committed, by the way, to Portsmouth 400 to getting up hopefully 2, if not 3 installations in the year 2023, and they will be co-branded History Through Art as a part of Friends of Ruth Blay and Portsmouth 400, and they are part of our gift to the city for the
Great.
Portsmouth 400 effort. Yep.
That's great.
Yeah.
How do people get involved with the History Through Art group?
They
Can they
can
do that?
visit friendsofruthblay.org.
Friends of Ruth Blay. Yes.
Yes, friendsofruthblay.org. Yep. And we have a newsletter sign up on the website. We have a place where you can donate. We will be working with Portsmouth Historical Society to do t-shirts going forward as a fundraising effort. And if you have any other time, you can.
You froze for just a second there. Laura?
Yes.
Oh, you've been freezing on and off for the past couple seconds.
Okay. I'm going to start closing out some of these programs in the background.
Yes.
That didn't work anyway. Yeah. I'm so sorry about that.
It worked out in the end. I think everyone got to see the images.
Go to Court Street. It looks good in real life.
Does anyone have any? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to add that the sketch that was done was only 18 inches, so it has to go into a computer vector file in order to get blown up to the 16 feet that it ended up. So when you look at it from close up, it looks like it's a pixelated camouflage kind of image. So you have to when you step back, it kind of clicks in and it looks like the drawing that it was. But when you get really close, it's kind of odd. It's really interesting to see the vector file and the pixelation, but it's fun to also really see it click in from a distance.
So going forward with the next project, we will be issuing a call to artists in the very near future. We are hoping to have a female artist for the next drawing, for the next art visualization of the historical figure. We have talked about having a mentor-mentee relationship, that perhaps we'd have a senior artist and that we'd have that person mentor an up-and-coming new artist and that they would create the artwork together. We expect to have call to artists for all the projects going forward, hoping to use artists of color. Going forward, we have historical figures of color on our list, and that would be very important to us to include all people in our background here in Portsmouth, in the Seacoast, in those. I'm sure there would be a fundraising portion of that, perhaps, but really, if you know any artists, that would be great. Send them our way. All of our projects going forward need a building and therefore a building owner. They will need an artist and to work with it, an historian, because we want an historian associated with each of our projects. So we need 3 people, 3 primary people involved in each of our projects. So if you know anyone, we are always open to hearing about them and contacting them. We'll take it from there, but if you have anybody you'd like to send our way, please do. Yes, I think Nancy would like to say something. She wants to add something. You're still mute.
Okay. Sorry, it said the host won't let me unmute myself.
Oh.
So I just wanted to sort of tie everything up and explain why we're talking about public art visually and not, say, through poetry or fiction or music. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason to have public art, and that's sort of the backbone of the vehicle to send this message. And I just want to think about public art in general, not necessarily specifically connected to Ruth Blay, but I think it would be great if you've got Ruth Blay in your mind right now. But when we're talking about public art, we're just simply talking about something, a creative work, an idea that's in a public space. It can be outdoors, it can be indoors, but it's in a public space for all to enjoy. And what it does for the average person in those communities, it activates the imagination. It encourages people to pay attention to what is around them. It stimulates learning and thinking about your community, about society, about our interconnectedness. It can enhance our quality of life, and it's very important for those that don't usually have access to other art forms. They're not going to museums in Boston or New York, or it's even hard for them to get to Manchester. Public art is always there for them anytime they need it. Public art provides that intersection between our past, our present, and our future. It can combine and intersect disciplines and ideas. And as we know from the Ruth Blay mural, it can memorialize, it can commemorate, but it can also explain, it can reflect the community, it can celebrate. But something that I think not a lot of people think about is it's not meant to be beautiful. And sometimes public art isn't even meant to be enjoyed. And it's not something that you want to hang over your sofa or put in your own home. Its purpose is to make you think. Its purpose is to spark conversation. And sometimes its purpose is to do that about something uncomfortable or even ugly. And even though we don't always know it, public art always has something to say. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about a different piece of public art in town. And many of you probably know the little mural outside of the coffee shop on Daniel Street. She's holding a jump rope and she's got the bumblebees. Everybody know that mural? So the mural was painted by a Los Angeles-based artist whose name is Bumblebee Loves You. That's the name of the artist. And he uses a technique of stenciling and mixed media to create image of children. And he focuses on children and he puts them on what he calls unloved walls. And his work deals with issues such as child homelessness, the impact of modernity on nature, and the disconnect. So that little mural on Daniel Street has something really big to say. So I tell you this story, and we're here to talk about Ruth Blay and all the other projects for history through art, because we want you to think about what the job of public art is doing. So when you're around town, give whatever art you're looking at, there's plenty of it, give it a second look and try to imagine what the artist was thinking when they created that work. What does that work evoke in you? And what does it make you think about? And there's no wrong answers. And that is the beauty of public art.
So I'm going to add one last comment, and then I'm going to turn it over to Nicole and Paulina. And that is, not only is Carolyn's book available for loan from the Portsmouth Public Library, but it is also available from River Run and Portsmouth Historical Society if you're inclined to purchase it as well. Carolyn's very modest. I know that she wouldn't say that herself, but we're here to help. So Nicole and Paulina, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for this opportunity tonight. And we're happy to answer any additional questions in the remaining time.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Thank you to all of you, to Nancy and Laura and Carolyn and Terrence. I'm not sure if he's here anymore. Thank you to all of you for being here tonight. I've put a couple of links to library stuff in the chat if anyone would like to click that before they leave. If you have any last minute questions, you can ask them, or feel free to unmute yourselves and say goodbye on the way out, or just leave if you'd like. Thank you for coming, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you
everyone.
Bye-bye.